Today, we talk with Nancy Sylvester, IHM. She links contemplative practice to decades of social justice work and a commitment to living out the spirit of Vatican II.
Hearing how she weaves that history into practical guidance raises a compelling question. What if contemplation is one of the most powerful social tools we've overlooked for positive social change? You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast produced by Max Kuzma and Emma Cieslik, lifelong Catholics and members of the LGBTQ community.
We explore Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology, and we're so glad you're here to join us. Nancy's story is a fascinating one, in that it begins at such a pivotal moment, with her entering religious life as Vatican II was reshaping the church, and how her relationship with prayer has continued to inform everything that she's done since.
Yeah, she entered formation as religious life was undergoing seismic change in the church, and then spent decades in social justice leadership, watching those early shifts ripple outward into real ministry and activism.
She's lived through global transitions in religious life, led national organizations, and worked directly in movements for justice. So when it comes to talking about contemplation shaping how we meet complexity or conflict, she's drawing from a lifetime of navigating those realities herself.
It becomes clear that contemplation for her is not a withdrawal from the realities of ordinary life, but a steadying force for facing the present moment fully and mindfully. I loved this conversation.
Me too. Nancy also has books available for sale, which you can find out more about by visiting iccdinstitute.org and Amazon. Let's get into it.
Nancy Sylvester, IHM, founded the Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue in 2002. Prior to that, she served in elected leadership positions both within her religious congregation, the Sisters, Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, IHM, of Monroe, Michigan, and in the presidency of the National Leadership Conference of Women Religious, LCWR. She served on the staff of Network, a DC-based Catholic social justice lobby, for 15 years, 10 years as executive director. Nancy is a well-known speaker, writer, and process facilitator. She has co-authored 2 books, Trouble in Beauty, Women Encounter Catholic Social Justice Teaching, and Crucible for Change. Her articles have appeared in a variety of publications. She has an undergraduate degree in philosophy and political science from St. Louis University and a master's in human development from St. Mary's University in Winona, Minnesota. www.iccdinstitute.org is a place you can find more information. Her new book is Journey Faith in an Entangled World. Nancy, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Max and Emma. Really, I'm delighted to join you today and on your podcast. And I'm looking forward to this conversation on some, I hope, pretty critical issues.
Absolutely. We are so glad to have you here. Nancy, you've talked about your Chicago Catholic schoolgirl upbringing. One that I resonate with especially, and how deeply that experience shaped your spiritual life for many years. You also entered religious life right in the midst of Vatican II, a moment when the church, and especially women religious, were being called to reimagine what it meant to live out their vocations. What was it like for you to grow up with a version of Catholicism that was rapidly changing throughout your discernment process? And how did those early experiences shape your own understanding of faith and of community?
Very good, Emma. It was a challenge, and they shaped me, those early experiences, quite significantly. First, I'll have to give my age here. I was born in 1948, and so I actually was in grade school in the 50s and then entered high school in the early 60s. So it was truly a pre-Vatican II church. And for those of you who aren't Catholic, that Vatican II is a very significant watershed moment in terms of the church beginning to open the windows of a system and a belief system and doctrine that hadn't really changed for hundreds of years. Okay. I loved the pre-Vatican Church. I mean, I loved growing up. The Catholicism has sacraments, so your body's involved, your smells, there are smells, the incense, the candles, the rituals, the prayer books. It was a time when things were in Latin, but you had prayer books, and I had every one of them, the Marian Missal, the Maryknoll Missal, the St. Paul, you name it, I had it. There was always a part of me that loved to pray. Let me just say that, written down words, prayer. And we lived, as my mother would say, in walking distance to the church. We lived across the street. So I was able to sort of run back and forth and participate in many things. And I had an aunt who lived with me, and she really was sort of the other. She always would say, honey, if I was sick or something, you don't have to go to church. She was like this little voice of future in my life. You don't have to obey everything so solidly, but I did then. And so I really was a pious child, and I loved it. And I think it shaped me very much. And so in the 1950s, given that context, if you loved God and wanted to be perfect, which I did, you really only had one option, and it was to enter religious life. And there were 62 of us who entered in 1966 in Monroe, Michigan. So you had this incredible community, eventually one we would call, in this congregation. And we began to study. We began to study the documents. Our sisters were sent to study theology right during the beginning of the council. So we had people who already were imbibing the philosophy and theology of what was going to become the teaching of the church. So it was rather exhilarating, except it also was extremely challenging. I thought I was entering a congregation where I have a habit. I changed my name. I would always teach, and we would always dress the same, do the same things, and have this horarium. All of a sudden, we weren't going to change our names. We were the last class to wear the habit, and things just rapidly changed. So there was a moment when I thought it didn't make sense to me. I thought I was losing my faith. And our general superior at the time was a very wise woman. And she sort of said to me as I wrote her a letter in the winter months, you really shouldn't make a decision now, she said, about your future, especially with this weather. And I thought I was insulted. Weather? But she was very wise, because when you start to do your own transformation, and we'll talk more about this, I hope, a little bit later, you really start to see what you had held so tightly. You sort of start to let go of it if you can, and to do it in a community. So I knew the community was going to carry me. And so I kept going, and I did continue in philosophy, which really was rather significant, and theology. So my intellect was being opened up, and then we were learning to pray. And so praying became part of also the study. And those two started to dance with each other. And so I wouldn't have called it entangled then, but clearly it was. But as it goes on, I didn't always like all those prayers anymore.
Yeah. So at what point in this journey through your relationship with prayer, how did you begin to understand contemplation?
Yeah. Well, prayer is extremely important. And we know, and because today many people are returning, actually it's interesting. I think there's going to be a surge somewhat in a more traditional faith. But in that time, the prayers were always formulated by the official church. And I liked them growing up. But when I started studying theology and started understanding the Catholic social justice teaching of the church, and at the same time being aware of the feminist movement, I really had trouble with prayers that place God as male only. And that male language, I could not pray it in a way that it was meant to be. And so I really thought at a moment, again, after I started teaching, after I'd finished my undergraduate degree, that I was losing my faith. And I had a very profound experience that said, no, you had to give up the faith of your fathers, colloquially, that the things that I grew up with, but that I did have faith, and concept of God would always be changing. Now, somehow that freed me. And with the reading I was doing, touching into some of the mystics, we learned about Teresa of Avila, Teilhard de Chardin. Some of them I started then practicing different ways of praying. And over a period of time, I would enter into more of the Buddhist meditation. And then in the last, I'd say 20 years or so, have really done the centering prayer in terms of contemplation. Because contemplation for me is not simply a meditation. It truly is a non-discursive type of prayer. You're not to use your head. And I'm a very head person. The intellect is important to me. And so what happens is when you go to prayer, if I'm always reading things, I'm thinking about it very quickly. I'm trying to figure out, well, this word, I have to change that word, or that concept doesn't work with me anymore. And so what contemplation says to you is, let it go. We don't want you to think. We don't want you to be emotional. So I think sometimes you've had a meditation where you say, become someone in the parable, become the young brother in the prodigal son, or be the older brother or the father. How do you feel? All those things are good. But the contemplation that I really have found to be extremely powerful and for me extremely transformative is this letting go of the thoughts and the emotions and creating a space. It seems a little bit like, what do you mean create space? Is it nothing there? No, but if you believe that there's more to this reality than our material existence, that what we can measure and weigh, there is other dimensions to which the divine love of God continues to embrace us. And it's in us as well. And so how do we silence that and over time become aware of all the things, the worldviews, the things that have shaped us, and we can sort of let it go and see what is arising in us as we try to proceed to be more loving and enter into a more responsive mode with the world. So to me, contemplation became a lifeline. Actually, it was really a richness. And so it's a practice. And you go in and out, of this state, but 20 minutes twice a day is what I try to do in order to continue to make that deeper and deeper. And the realizations happen in the everyday life. It doesn't always happen when I'm doing it. So I found that to truly be, for me, an incredible gift, and one that even though a lot of people say it's a gift, I think it's a gift we're all given, and we just have to unwrap it. And I think in today's world, where there's so little or less involvement with tradition, perhaps this could speak to people in a greater way, that we have within us Christ consciousness, and how do we keep opening ourselves to it.
That is absolutely perfect. This wasn't in our questions, but I just wanted to share how much that means to me. As someone with OCD, something I really struggle with is how I can connect meaningfully with meditation. Because often without that structure, and just as you mentioned, without that focus on the head and engaging with something concrete, it's difficult to know how I can contribute to and be part of this tradition. But I think what you're saying is that not only is this something we can all share in, but this is an accessible form of engaging, an accessible way that people can encounter ritual and sensory exploration that is disconnected from this previous Vatican tradition, but perhaps equally meaningful and rewarding to the people who encounter it.
Emma, I think that is so true, because it's connected to mysticism, and that's something that the church always was afraid of. And part of that's because the teaching church until the 1500s, most people weren't educated. And so there was a concern that they would go into themselves and create these, create crazy thoughts, which can happen. But I think as we get educated, if we have a community to test what are our insights on, to test them so that you're not, and it is for healthy people, but, we're all healthy and we're all unhealthy a little bit. And it's also, I want to say, if it doesn't work for people, that's okay. There are other, because in this case, there's some development of consciousness that hopefully I'll get to a little bit later that affects all of this. But I think, thank you for that comment. And I know it has been extremely helpful to me. So
I'm so glad. And I just want to say, I also appreciate that. Not everyone is going to connect with a specific tradition, but we're so grateful that you're here sharing something new that people can engage with and connect.
Thanks.
So you've written beautifully about Pentecost, the anointing fire and rushing wind that didn't erase difference, but revealed the Spirit alive in every language and culture gathered that day. You describe it as a moment when diversity itself became holy, a reminder that difference isn't division and oneness isn't sameness. That sounds like such a profoundly non-dual way of seeing the world. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? In your own journey as a woman religious and a contemplative, how have you learned to live into that vision, to see diversity and openness not as a challenge to unity, but as expressions of the Spirit's fullness among us?
Yeah. Well, you certainly understood what I was trying to say in those words. And I have to say, when I do my contemplative sitting and over time, and every month I've been doing these Global Sisters reflections, which that came from. And I really feel when I sit down to write, it's coming from this other space in me. And so it's not to give an excuse, but of course I try to live that way, but I don't always achieve it. But let me try to unpack this a bit. You're absolutely right in terms of moving from a dualistic way of looking at the world to a much more holistic way. And this is where I think a good liberal arts education is critical. You start to learn about their history and also what we would call worldviews and what occurred at different times. And so I need to just say that when we entered into the age of enlightenment, or the scientific revolution, which continues to shape our thinking today, we started to split science from theology. And so with Descartes and the whole reason becomes important, the both and way of thinking gets sort of put aside because it was around earlier. We get to an either or. The one is better than the other. You have, in the sense of, in this case, women were always considered inferior to men. Now, patriarchy existed before, but during that time, so men were related to spirit, to reason, to achievement. Women were like with emotions. They weren't that real. They were aligned with, nature. And later we know what happened. We've split from nature. And those years are still in us and they're still developing. And so I've done a lot of work on the development of consciousness. And consciousness not simply being something in your brain that can be figured out, but this consciousness that really exists beyond that. And it's some quantum physicists talk about quantum consciousness, as does many developmental psychologists, that see that as we are evolving, we continue to widen and open up and see and embrace a larger picture of reality. We might start to see from wholeness, WHOLENESS. And then we see that first, and then we see the parts. So rather than seeing someone and today we're so horrible at this. We're just, what we're hearing all over the place is really this either or, and it's getting worse in the sense of seeing difference as really dangerous to us, rather than seeing that it is part of that whole evolutionary flow. If you read Teilhard de Chardin, although again writing at a much earlier time in the 40s and 50s, but what does he understands that we keep growing in our diversity. So when I was reading that Pentecost thing, I thought, really, this is quite profound because there they all were, speaking their own language, but all working together to proclaim, in this case, the gospel, or it probably wasn't written yet, but to proclaim the message. And so seeing we've got to start to see that. And what I try to do, and part of contemplation is getting in touch with you, inside of you. So when I start to think, why is that person talking like that? I stop and you become much more aware and you say, okay, why not? They're representing perhaps a geographical area, a different racial mix. What's the matter there? They just don't sound like you. Is that so negative? How do you start to work with yourself to see there's a beauty in that? I may not talk like that. But I'm not I'm not blaming and it's, you start to see how we need each other. Evolution is really moving toward greater and greater diversity. And we forget that in the genome, it was the genomes, we're closer together than apart. But again, you've got to know some of these things. If you don't know they're even real, as we have problems with evolution, some people still don't believe in it. That consciousness, that there's a stage of development where that's extremely okay. And without judging stages, it's not hierarchical. It's more like in our experience, and our experiences are different, we keep opening up. And so that stage then gets broadened. What used to be maybe we were only in tribes, then we became part of different religions, but we still had, then we moved out into different nation states. And clearly, the United States became a challenge because it was a truly a lot of differences. And we've yet to understand how to live, I think, in a pluralistic democracy. We don't know this reality yet. So I think it's a future piece where we see things connected first. And it's part of every mystical tradition in every faith, tradition of every faith tradition. You end up seeing everything as one. And it's an incredible sense of connectedness. And the eco-spirituality piece is also connected to that, because you understand it's not just humans. We're all evolving together. But boy, that is not something that's in a lot of the literature and or on the pulpits, because we're young in it. It's hard to think, my 77 years, it's young to be thinking this way. And we're seeing a backlash, and it's a challenge, I think.
And I think it fits into the question of Aristotelian dualism. So one thing that I was thinking as you were sharing this was that so much of our understanding about difference in terms of sexism, transphobia, homophobia is rooted in an idea of in and out groups. So just as you say, I think the heart of social justice initiatives and celebrating difference is deconstructing the ways in which creating in-groups for ourselves and enforcing out-groups for others is a spiritual journey of reconciliation and appreciating difference for what it can bring to our communities.
Oh, lovely, lovely statement.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I think it's important. I sometimes talk about in our conversations putting on my history hat. And at the heart of what you say is the idea that this dualism itself is rooted in our deconstruction of patriarchy and power difference within the church itself. So a way we envision forward, a way that privileges women's voices, that uplifts climate justice, is one that by necessity has to challenge the very systems that have sometimes given the church power. And it's not meaning to deconstruct what the church is or what it can offer to people, but imagining what it can be next.
I want to underscore that last part, because for those of you growing up without the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, I'm not sure how young you are, that to understand that that's a very short amount of time to change critical values and structures in people. And that's probably why it's the older generations, if they haven't been exposed intellectually to things, then they can't bring all that into their emptying of them, into their prayer, to try to see what's there. But it really isn't a long time. And I think what is happening, I've spent some time trying to reflect on this, is truly, the mistakes were made, I think, as we've moved through this cultural thing. But the danger is now to go so far back in terms of what's happening with women in particular and immigrants, gay, lesbian rights. How do we see and be able to talk about respecting each of them, and how are they contributing to our whole? Right now, it's all toxic. Everything is, if you say anything like this, they say, oh, you're a Democrat and you're woke and you're this and you're that. And most people aren't following all this. I mean, it's just like, depending on what they read and see, and they get sort of caught up in it, because contemplation invites you to become awake to who you are, how you're responding to things, what's triggering you, and how do you begin to open that up? How do you begin to see? Because if anything in the scripture And of course, we know it's not literal. That came out of Vatican II, but we know many people hold the gospel literally, is that we are all one and that there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free. But boy, we don't help people understand that or how to work with it. So I think to get together to see what we need for the future is I think a challenge and a quest for people, all of us who are thinking this way at this time.
So well said. And it's a perfect transition to my next question. In one of your reflections for Global Sisters Report, you described the clatter of a building being torn down right outside your window, happening every morning as you tried to sit in contemplation. You write that learning to be still and that noise mirror the spiritual work we're all called to do in chaotic times. Perfect transition to what you were just talking about, to hold space and stay present, even as the world feels like it's coming apart. What have you learned about the kind of inner stillness that's necessary for moments like this, when everything around us is being gutted and remade? And how does contemplation help us to respond not with despair, but with the creative energy to rebuild?
Well, luckily, it got really nicely rebuilt. It's right next door. So I have hope, because if they can do it in the building, we can do it in our world. It was interesting. I just had a program called Rest in a Time of Chaos. And the two presenters used Walter Brueggemann, who's a Protestant theologian, on his Sabbath. And it was just saying how rest can be resistance to the empire. And what it's meant is, everything around us says we've got to be productive. We got to respond. We got to react, not respond. We got to react. We got to be doing everything. And there's so many things going wrong. And we're all just highly, probably doing more Facebook pages and more of this and more. And truly to stop and to say, that's not going to move us anywhere. That's not going to move the needle. It'll just keep strengthening it. To step back and truly rest in that emptiness. It's also reminds me of, Saint John of the Cross talked about the dark night of the soul. And Constance Fitzgerald, who's a Carmelite sister, a cloistered Carmelite sister from Baltimore, wrote an incredible essay that influenced me greatly in terms of impasse and the dark night. And she likened these moments when we are in such a stage of powerlessness and what are we going to do and I don't have any power at all, is to really take hold that you are really going through a very critical growth stage in terms of seeing how do we go in ourselves to let go of what is driving that so that we can find all the words sort of are lame, not comfortable, not quiet, but you're getting to the really core of what is happening? Why am I reacting that way? What is it? What is it in me? And what is the spirit, the God's loving presence in my core telling me, emerging? And so it starts so that you can actually say, okay, I don't need to do everything. Now, the danger, but when you hear that, and if you're an activist, that's really hard because then you think you're not doing anything. And then you think it's, you're by doing nothing, you're then condoning it. So that's another thing. Maybe to say I understand is not condoning. And I'm sort of at right now for myself, for really looking at some of the MAGA people, it's to truly try to understand where they're coming from. I'm not condoning them, but I'm not going to go on the attack either. I don't think that helps. Thomas Merton has a beautiful thing that says, you can do all the great work, but if all you are doing it is out of sort of spite or hatred or that's all people are really going to see. And I think if you think about it, the people who are the smooth talkers who tell you something and deep down they're like putting a knife in your back, kind of thing, that you just have to be clear in yourself. And the more we can enter into our Christ consciousness and respond out of in the book, I have a section on witnessing presence with Cynthia Bourgeot does a very good job in terms of talking about responding from that deepest place. And we're part of this larger energy field. And we are we are affecting something. It's not as visible, but it's happening. So that's a belief I have. And it's important, I think, that we have that stillness, that we can do that. Because how do you respond when you're right in the midst of it all? And you got it. It's practice. Practice makes perfect. So
I love it. And it made me think of, I think at the heart of what you're saying resonates with so many people, because in a world where we see so much chaos around us and we see such injustice, there's an impetus to give and sacrifice ourselves fully in the mission of resistance. But I really love Tricia Hershey, specifically, is a New York Times bestselling author who wrote the book Rest is Resistance. And Hershey specifically is a visionary artist and founder of the NAP ministry. And it all talks about the idea of embracing rest as not only a healing spiritual practice, but also as an abolitionist one, and one fighting capitalism and white supremacy. And it made me think of that.
Well, that's actually what the two women who presented for the Institute last Saturday talked about, Hershey's NAP ministry. Exactly. As a type of resistance, and the use of it within the Black community early on. So there's really great history. So if we can start to get some of this stuff out more, and it doesn't mean you're quiet. It's not quietude. It's none of that, but it's truly in a world in which everything is sort of, you have to go on Facebook, you got to make it known, you got to scream, it's not, obviously it's not helping, because all we're doing is greater polarization. We've got to find new ways of talking to each other and responding. And it's got to be in us first, before we can do it, I think. But I'm glad you
well said.
told more about the NAP ministry.
Oh, I absolutely adore it. And I think especially as someone with chronic illness, there's a difficulty of wanting to sacrifice my whole self. And it's the model that we see within the church that is based on the idea of a sacrificial Jesus giving his whole self, his whole life and body for people. And so for many people within these resistance frameworks that are seeking to correct injustice, there's an expectation that we have to give our entire selves. And it's a useful model of giving our entire effort, but also being knowledgeable that if we give our entire selves, we cannot be part of the movement to rebuild and reimagine what comes next.
And don't forget that in the scriptures, in the recording of it years after Jesus died, one thing that keeps coming through is he took time to pray. He withdrew from the crowd. He went 40 days in the desert. He went over the lake by himself, so it's to remind us that you can't do what I think Jesus did without prayer. And it's not like he wanted to die. It's just that the political powers at that time saw him such a threat. So I think it's important that we keep ourselves healthy in whatever way we can. And if we're suffering from chronic condition, to realize that too is part of the gift of to use it as part of resistance, I think. And people like yourselves need to write about that, probably speak about it.
I love it. And what you're saying, I think, is so important, because many of us feel guilty for the rest that we need to take and not able to contribute in the same ways. So what you're saying, especially from a person who's within the church and who's done this work, means a great deal. It really does.
Yeah. And just things about the community, but remember, we all are contributing something to the whole. So none of us are doing the whole thing. It's the whole is all of us within us. And so we need each other. So if you're not there, it'll be lost, but you're there in a new way. And that's what's contributing. And the same way with me, but we have to think there's some new ways to think, because otherwise we're going to exhaust ourselves. And then what good are we at all?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. As we discussed, you entered religious life at a really interesting time in the midst of Vatican II, and came of age during the Vietnam War, civil rights, and the women's liberation movement, all times of tremendous upheaval and transformation. You've spent decades working for justice, from counseling conscientious objectors, and lobbying with Network to help religious communities engage the Vatican investigations through contemplation and dialogue. Looking back, what moments of historical solidarity stand out to you as touch points that shaped your understanding and help you navigate our present moment of upheaval and social chaos?
I'll start in St. Louis. I was there from 69 to 71. So it was the height of the Vietnam War. It was Kent State. And so I was a draft counselor because Catholicism had not yet come out to say unlike Quaker, you're automatically a conscientious objector. So there was a way of we had a way of discussing it and what they could go to and try to appeal so they can get out of the war grip. But we also had a strike. We had we didn't go to classes. So for about 3 weeks, we didn't go to class. It was toward the end of the semester. And the issue at St. Louis was we wanted to get the ROTC off campus. Now, regardless of where people feel about that now, and also I think Vietnam is something that we probably need to look at again in retrospect, and how many young men and women were really hurt and demoralized in all of that. But for us, the teaching here was, we came together, there was conversation with the president, the head of the committee, and then I remember being at the green. St. Louis at that time, there was only a little patch of green, was a quadrangle in front of the administration building. And we were all there when the windows opened and the leader of the strike and the president of the university came out and said the ROTC was going to be taken off campus. The exhilaration of two things, feeling that we won, but knowing you could critique things within the system, is what I left with. That there was success, and I think we need success. And I always feel bad as people today, but there was success there. We won. And one could stay within the system and critique it. So that has been with me, and probably one of the reasons I went to work in a political arena, in the political arena, because you are in the system, but you're challenging it within the church. The second one was right after this 3-week session, and then we were told we were going to lose all our credit, which is not helpful. We did not, but that was the threat. The blacks on campus, which weren't many, but they were part of the anti-war movement, they said they wanted to strike. Now, I remember talking with one of the leaders and thinking, should I say, I don't think this is the greatest time? But then what I realized was, they're the leaders and they need to do this. And so I'll support them. So the importance of sometimes doing things, even if it's not quite how you would want it, but it's going to assist with those who are most affected by it. The next would probably be in Washington, where it was really, it was a time 77 to 92. So I know it still sounds like ancient history to many, but it was a time when you could cross the aisle, meaning Republican and senators. And we had a network, had an amendment. I was lobbyist at that time. So we had an amendment to a co-op bank bill, and I was working it. And one of the most conservative senators in the Senate was chair of that committee in the finance. And I got to know his aide very well. And his aide and he'd say to me, these are his questions. So I'd go back, and Network had a system whereby we had local people involved at all the congressional districts and states. So contacting them, they would talk, I'd go back, he'd come back and forth. Well, it's the day of the vote, and this senator voted for our amendment. Now, it was and I could see the aide on the floor, and I remember him smiling and waving at me, and I acknowledging me. That vote was taken. I don't know if you know much about voting records, but basically it was very common that important organizations would watch how people vote and then do a voting record. And one of the conservative groups, to which this senator was 100%er, chose this vote as one of the votes they would take. So for the first time, he was not 100% on that voting thing. So the significance is that he was willing to listen to his aide, who was willing to talk with me, and the two of us respected each other sufficiently that he could move that man to vote. So again, it's the possibility existed. Now, I cannot say that could happen today. I don't want to pretend that, but it does. It's the things that you grow, you learn, you experience, and it stays with you with that little bit of hope that you have. And then having so many women and men come to what we used to have a seminar every summer. So I teach all these people how to lobby and go on the Hill and do it. It was so great to see this incredible influx of younger people all over coming and taking ownership of their country and their democracy, which of course is sorely missing today. And then of course and then the formation of ICCD was another time when the willingness to speak something publicly that you sensed people were experiencing, but you weren't sure. So in this case, this was when I was president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and we had gone to Rome. We go to Rome every year for 3 years in that position. And this particular one, I was getting ready to do the presidential address in Two Falls. And, it's the turn of the millennia, and you want to give this hopeful address and say how marvelous everything is. And as I allowed, really, I let go of what I thought I should write. And what emerged was that many women religious were at an impasse with many in the hierarchical church. And we really couldn't use the same ways of doing the work of opposing or talking. We needed to really imagine new ways rooted in our core self, our deepest self. And that's really what gave birth, in a sense, to the Institute, that we had to engage in contemplation and dialogue to imagine something new. So I've taken those lessons with me. I have to say right now, it's very hard, especially having been in the political arena, to see what's happening and to see it with a decent understanding of it. I mean, having worked there for 15 years. So it is hard, but I still believe that we can't, it goes back to the rest. We can't just keep trying to do everything on every issue, whatever, to try to get perspective, to try to return to that center, to try to understand where we were wrong. I mean, my way isn't the only way now, and how to start to understand that differently. And I start to see it doesn't help me just to get angry at the TV. It doesn't help me to just say how stupid, what are we doing? Where are people? So it's getting back to my inner self. And centering prayer has a marvelous aspect that's called the welcoming prayer, where you begin to welcome those feelings, not the thing that caused them. But, sometimes if you're feeling angry, you think, I shouldn't feel angry. No, you are angry. But you're not accepting the thing that made you, you're accepting that feeling. And so it tries to get you into a somatic way of understanding what's going on. And then you keep praying. It's a very specific technique. And I write about it a bit in my book, and it's certainly in the centering prayer movement. Eventually, you find, and I say it this way, it goes. You let it go. You let it go. Not because you thought about it to let it go. You literally, your body lets it go. And then you sort of welcome it so it can go. And it's just a way, I think, of trying to free us to get some new responses. And because it goes deep, our negative behaviors are deep in us. I mean, we are both. We are all. We're good and we're bad. We've got those things in us that just are hard to get rid of. And each of us has our own, probably. I mean, we're not all the same here, but we all have something that just catches us there. So I try to now to really say, well, where are the people that I disagree with? Where are they coming from? Why am I so disgusted when I don't think Mr. Trump is being held responsible or accountable? What's in that in me? There's a certain intellectual, yes, but the emotions here. How do I try to live to examine it, I guess, an examined life, probably.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that what you're talking about is touching on the themes that run through your work about the interconnectedness of all life and the ways that contemplation can transform our understandings of justice, relationships, and the world. So drawing on this, I'm curious kind of where eco-spirituality fits in, this awareness of our deep relational ties to the natural world, which can shape how we discern, act, and uphold human and ecological dignity today. How might practices of contemplation help us attune to the wisdom and intelligence inherent in the earth, as you've described somewhat through your work with ICCD?
Yeah. Well, for certainly, eco-spirituality is critical. I mean, it's one of the earliest. Joanna Macy was probably the first, perhaps the first. I'm not sure. Well, no, Divine Milieu I picked up in 1966 when I entered the congregation and was just taken with it, even though my head didn't understand it. But there was something about this kind of, the material world is good. There is something here, rather than material world and all the resources are for the human man to do something with. And I did choose those words explicitly. But what you get with eco-spirituality is, again, that immersion into the whole evolutionary process, that we are emerging out of all the earlier forms and that all of life is connected. So you can't, to say we can't be bothered with flooding in like Gaza right now, or perhaps more, perhaps in the Philippines, is crazy, because that's going to have an effect on the oceans, effect on us. And the thing is, we didn't know all this before. There may have been some who did, but I don't think this was a conspiracy, at least not in the early years when industrialization and all the ways that we exploited resources. Certainly our native, indigenous sisters and brothers knew this. And it's interesting. This just goes a little bit back to the development of consciousness. There's a whole, not a whole move, but a lot of people saying what we need again is we're supposed to move forward and take with us the best of the previous stages. We fail to do that. And so what the indigenous, it's not that we're going to go back and believe that the earth erupted on the back of a turtle necessarily, but to understand how that closeness to nature, that interconnection is being expressed in 2025, 26, 27. How are we seeing it so connected? So I think the reading of it, understanding it, and then taking it in. So sitting and just letting nature, just touch you, not say, oh, this is a nice elm tree and it's 6 feet tall, da da da. Just allow the visual, the listening, use your senses. I have a little piece in the book about using the senses, because Brother David Stendelrast, who's a Catholic priest, but is also steeped in Eastern tradition, had us on our retreat for first profession work on our each sense. So just go and listen. Just use your ear. Try not to use your other senses. What are you experiencing? Use your smell. Use your taste. It just, again, it tries to make us more embodied, which we have sort of failed to do sometimes through the age of reason. How to feel that this understanding is really in your whole body, not just in your head. And that again takes time. But I think it's incredible. And this whole work on biomimicry, how can we learn from our nature and animals ways of being? So, the example of the geese who fly in a formation, and when the leader gets tired, that goose goes to the back and someone else takes the lead. There are so many things that we could learn if we understood that we're connected in some way, and not just this anthropomorphic triumphalism or whatever you want to talk about.
I love how you put it. And it made me think of one other thing, especially as someone with OCD and anxiety. What you talk about of sensory embodiment actually refers back to one of my favorite grounding rituals and routines, specifically the idea of, it's called the 5-4-3-2-1 routine. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but typically people go through, and it's a way that they can situate and ground themselves in the space that they exist within. And I think there's such an overlap between what you're saying of connecting with nature and what this routine is. So it's asking people, and I'll do very briefly, so I don't want to take up our time. It's asking people to name what they see, hear, smell, touch, and taste around them. So 5 things you can see around you, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So in moments when you might feel a panic or anxiety attack building, it's a way that you can connect with what's around you in order to feel safety and security. And what you say, I think, fits so perfectly with how this connects to one another. I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think there's a great overlap of finding spiritual ecological importance with grounding ourselves during the present moment of chaos.
Yes, for sure.
So something that you've spoken beautifully about is the transformative power of seeing anew, allowing contemplation to widen our perception, for example, beyond what the dominant white, straight, male Christian narratives have taught us to see. And I think this ties into our embodiment conversation as well, because not all of us are white, straight men. So to be embodied and to be aware and present and grounded means to discover something different than that dominant narrative that so often gets expressed and discussed. So how do you understand the contemplative path as helping us to unlearn those inherited ways of seeing and make room for a more embodied, communal, and liberating view of reality?
Yeah, thank you. And even the way you express the question is so important. I think it is critical. It also takes time. It doesn't just happen. Although chances are, I'm still talking from a longer history, but now people are into the term morphogenetic field. Are you familiar with that? It's a concept that Rupert Sheldrake developed around, I'll do real quick, around monkeys in a specific part of the world. And he watched how they started to wash the potatoes before they ate them. And he kept track of the generations, and quickly, after 1 or 2 or 3, they were taught. And then pretty soon they did not have to be taught. They knew they now wash potatoes before eating them. And so what it sort of suggests is that every species has what he calls a morphogenetic field. Now that's not energy, but it's like learnings that each of us keep putting in, and we don't know when it's time that all of a sudden the next species already knows it. You might think about how little kids do their iPad already at age 1 or 2, if they have them. They don't have to be taught. And so in a certain way, that as each of us keep going, and the culture, the morphogenetic field of the human species has these aspects in them, we will grow into it faster. We certainly have, from tribal days, hatred, anger, violence, and we can see that being brought out again. But many of us have also been living out of more of a love and sense of equality, a sense of acceptance. So whatever we're doing, we are contributing to the morphogenetic field, which I think gives me hope. But okay, so contemplation then helps us to become aware of what we think and what we believe, and that we wake up. Ken Wilber, who's a real key person in terms of integral consciousness and all a development of consciousness, he talks about it as a waking up. And a lot of people use contemplation that way. Most of us, I think, live like sleepwalking in our world. And we'd only have to look at the people today. I mean, some of the people today, you think, yeah, where are they? Are they awake? And I don't mean woke the way that it's now been used in terms of the left. I mean, basically being awake. And the integral movement talks about that we get in touch with our constructed self. And Robert Keegan uses that. He's a Harvard psychologist. And that constructed self are all the things that our country tells us. And so growing up, we didn't see people who were physically challenged because there was no access. There was no buses that kept them. There was no trains. There was no sidewalks. And growing up in the south side of Chicago, it was pretty much white, although we were connected to we were adjacent to another black neighborhood, but you didn't see in the everyday world people who didn't quite look like you. So you realize how deep some of these images are, and how, again, it's important when you do a practice and you're trying to silence yourself so you can take a long, loving look at the real. And I often use that as a phrase around contemplation, because the real is here. You don't have to look beyond life for the real. You don't have to look up in the heavens for the real. It's here, but we don't see it. It's like we all wear different glasses. And so what we're envisioning and what we're seeing is just a piece of it. And so you keep trying to expand. You keep trying to understand. And it helps if you're reading about stuff. If you know people, the difference between meeting someone who's gay and imagining you're meeting someone who's gay, if you're coming from this perspective, is phenomenal. For me, it was the International Women's Year. They were having the U.S. delegates come down to Houston. I think it was 1977. It could have been 78. And a network had a booth there at the table. But we were there when the women's movement that had rejected the lesbian call for acceptance and into the movement had their resolution go to the floor. And I was up in the balcony with some other people, and it was crowded, really crowded. And it was so quiet. And the women passed it. And as soon as it passed it, all these balloons went up. And they were with the two female signs, And it was absolutely a thrilling. I looked around, and then these two older women, probably no older than I now, I thought older women were hugging each other. And what my thought was, why should that love not be allowed? It totally shifted how I began to view, as a good Catholic girl, the whole question around homosexuality and lesbianism, because there's something greater here that needs to be, but it has to come, you take it then to prayer, you realize things change. And part of the Catholic doctrine has not been subject to the kind of change of psychology and science and what we're learning in ways that have been able to, you see breakdown. I mean, Pope Francis and I think Pope Leo are trying to get there, but you've got this whole host of other people who are still pretty solidly in certain camps of understanding. But I think experience, allowing yourself to think things can change, opening yourself up, and really, it's not like it's hard because I say that because I think the God is in you. And so that emergence, you be sensitive to, and then you test it. You check it out with others too, so that you're not spinning your own world. But I think that transformation can happen. It certainly happened in my life. It certainly helps to have other people around you who see it the same way, with whom you can discuss it. And many times it may not happen. And so I was started to think about this in terms of like you play a musical instrument. Like I learned how to play the piano. And so I'd say, yeah, I can play the piano. But I'm not the pianist. I never decided to do the work needed to become a pianist. I've got my own, I love show tunes and I love that, but I'm not a pianist. Many people don't choose to go inward sufficiently to make their own inner work important. And I don't know what happens when you don't have any religious connection to think is inner work important at all. And I think we're not going to get far if we don't have inner work. That's the work that comes with rest, with the nap ministry. It's the rest. It's coming to know that is as important to the change as anything I can achieve or affect. That the who I am and the how I do it. And I think that's we need information. It's not like I can just if I'm not exposed to things, it's hard to be changed. So it's a dance of the intellect and the heart. You have heart knowledge now. It was intellect, sometimes intellect first, then heart first. Something's not feeling right. You go to the head. That's the entanglement for me. It's all entangled and it's all basically good.
Absolutely. I think that's so well said. And I did want to highlight that as you were sharing this idea that growing up, there wasn't an understanding of seeing disabled people around you. And I want to highlight that often because people either were not still around because they had passed away because of healthcare interventions that didn't exist, but also because of unsightly beggar ordinances that prohibited poor people and disabled people from existing in public. I do want to tie it back to what you had said earlier about how everyone shows up in different ways to their ministry. And so I think I wanted to contribute and highlight that I think there's great transformation through visibility, not only in seeing ourselves, but in helping other people see themselves as vital contributors to this conversation. So if it's just being a visible member of the community, if it's just visibly resting, or being someone that brings, as you say, this moment of celebratory love to you, that itself is a piece of resistance.
Yes, good. Thank you.
And then also, connected in there, and you did answer my question. Thank you. I feel like there's a connection here to the community piece, and also contemplation within or through a communal practice as well. So, how does practicing contemplation alongside others impact a person? What unique power does shared contemplative practice have in fostering connection, dialogue, and action in addressing the challenges of our time? And just a personal note, I attended Nancy leading contemplative prayer at the Dignity Conference in Columbus in June. So I got to experience this alongside other members of the community all together sharing in that time of contemplation. And I found it to be very powerful. So I'm not asking because I don't know. I'm asking because I want us to tell the audience as well.
Thanks, Mix. When I named the Institute, which is a very long name, so I'm not sure if I'd ever encourage anyone else to do that, but an Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue. And the reason I felt that back in 2001 is that contemplation is often thought about as a very private, a God and me kind of a thing, the image, cloistered sisters away from the world, cloistered priests, and people didn't have access to it. And I was feeling that the insights had come somewhat like a Quaker meeting. You need and want to be able to share and experience that energy with each other in holding it. And the more that we learn about energy, the more that becomes even more powerful. I have tended, and what I've done I do a lot of work with groups, primarily Catholic sisters, religious congregations. Before their chapter, they're on a decision-making piece or something is problematic or whatever. And I start everyone with a 20-minute sit every morning, if the time is allowed, at least a 10-minute sit. Because what you're really saying to each other as you consent, because part of falling deeply into that space is you consent for that divine energy, however you call God, and we still all call God differently by many names. But if that divine energy and within you, then, and you're saying, I'm consenting to you to change me. I'm consenting for transformation. And you're saying that with everyone around you. So everyone is then giving over that kind of space. The quality of the conversations are different. And I have the people who are in front of me tell me that they have always had trouble with this, and they were able to go to the next place. Did we have contemplative dialogue? I'm not sure. It's hard, because we can listen. We've got to learn to listen to each other first, and then to do the exchange. And we don't know how to listen sometimes, first of all. But again, and the community, what it says to me is, I'm now with everybody who has opened themselves to this. And so I'm willing to put down some defenses and try some new things. And I think that's powerful, as well as there are people better than I in feeling energy in a group. And I've had some very highly attuned people say the energy was amazing. So to me, that's very important. It's a piece of it. And then dialogue, because I think the insights have to be shared. I think we have to keep imagining what's possible. And I don't think it'll come from just one person. It's going to come from a group. And I've experienced that for sure, both in network staff meetings and when I was in leadership myself with our team. Probably the only two times where you really had everyone give their best, and you kept at it with everyone's insight, and all of a sudden it clicks. It's like this incredible synchronicity. Yes. And they're not going to say, oh, that was Mac's idea. That was Emma's. That was Nancy's. No, it really came from the whole. It's a part of, and then the ownership is there, and the movement and the energy, and you can feel this is right. But that takes time. And you got to bring a self-conscious self to the work, because we all know how to sabotage. We all know how to make those deals that someone in our administration loves to do. But that's not going to get us to a place where everyone's needs will be part of the conversation and create the new from that. The future isn't going to be, well, even if the far right takes hold, that's not going to get us into the future that we're going to keep working for, because it'll only shift the two poles. And instead of seeing some wisdom in polarities, learning from each other, we're splitting ourselves apart and just doing like a seesaw. Seesaw. But to me, that's where the power of this comes. But it's not easy. At least it's not easy.
Yeah, and I think this ties into one of the last questions that I want to ask you, and the way I think it ties in is it's kind of talking about, like, you know, it is okay, and not only just okay, but good to have expertise and to know what you know and what you can do well, but it is also extremely valuable to unite with others who also know their thing, you know? And so the question is, so your work is also drawing on insights from, as you've mentioned, quantum physics, evolutionary theory, and integral philosophy, alongside deep theological reflection. So the connection I'm making there is, you know, these are different disciplines that can be pulled together to kind of look at something more complexly. So how do you see this integration of science and faith enriching contemplative practice, particularly in helping us perceive our interconnections with one another, the natural world, and the cosmos? In what ways can this synthesis inform our engagement with urgent social and ecological challenges and help us act with wisdom, care, and a sense of responsibility within an interconnected universe?
Well,
not a small one to end on.
Simple question, isn't it? Yeah. You know, I can only speak to my own life. And so for me, my love of philosophy, my curiosity around things, I never was a specialist. I always was a generalist. When asked, do you want to go on for a PhD, which I could have, the wisdom that someone told me, they said, you have to really want to be in that discipline because your mind will be shaped by it. And I really found that very wise. And I thought, I don't want any one discipline, political science, theology, philosophy. I found them connected. And there was nothing at that time that I knew of in this a few decades ago that really brought it all together. And so I found other noetic science, the Institute for Noetic Science. I found different programs. I encountered Cynthia Bourgeault about 20 some years ago. All of a sudden, things came to me, and it sounds a little, it's not meant to be wooey, but I really believe in synchronicity. Things come into one's life and one understands in how it's integrated. And as I talked about some things, people didn't go, oh my God, what are you saying? But rather, oh, would you write that? Or, this makes sense. Or yes, we like. So it was sort of testing the public use. And so I don't consider myself a scholar in the traditional sense. But I know people who are scholars in a specific discipline and have never read the people I've read, never read Ken Wilber. They more want to know, well, what university does he teach at? Well, he doesn't. So it's a different platform. And so to me, those were critical because they opened up some of the things, especially those feminist theologians. And I had a chance to really know Elizabeth Fiorenza, Rosemary Radford, Ruther, Ilia Delio, Connie Fitzgerald, Mary Hunt, Cynthia Bourgeault, personally. And so in reading their readings, and that's what gives me confidence, I guess, and I still am a little bit hesitant here and there because I'm not the footnote. I mean, I have footnotes, yeah, but I read a very variety of people to integrate into my heart. And it always resonated with the prayer. It was always back into contemplation that I took it to see where it comes. And so I'm somewhat surprised when I do writing, especially in the book, Journey Faith. They're not very technical. I have a lot of footnotes, and that's where the technical stuff is. But when I let it go and let it say, okay, what's coming out, what's emerging as I write, I hope it's intelligible, heartfelt, and yet reflecting a little different look at some of the things that a lot of us have grown up with. And I hope that answers your question. I think it seemed to come from, all of a sudden it just came to me, all of this. So take it or leave it.
Yes. No, I think that was beautifully said. Thank you.
Most definitely. Most definitely. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us today. Is there anything else that you'd like to include that we didn't have a chance to cover?
Well, it's probably just variations on that theme. Probably not to give up hope, and that to see that the spirituality that's emerging, even out of the traditions, can be very rich. And I get a little nervous as some of the reports are saying there's an increase in the very conservative Orthodox Christian churches, Catholic Church, especially with men. And so I think there's a place there to find out what the fear and insecurity in the men who have been in power, well, naturally, because it's shifting. But how can we address that in ways that can be helpful to each other? And to somehow, and one of the probably I didn't say enough of is, it is that inner work that we do. It's like a glacier. We think we know our worst spots. We think, we've overcome this, but there's so much more. They just keep digging. And if you don't make your inner work a priority, I think we'll have just this return to the old. That doesn't mean there's some values in it, but we're not living any longer in the pre-Vatican II world, in the Middle Ages without the Age of Reason. We're living now, and we've got to use what we know and reflect on it in light of the values and the tradition and what we've learned, with a willingness to articulate it in new ways and maybe make some mistakes. But we need some environment. Otherwise, I think we will lose people to that the consumer culture and the like right now, money. That we could say right now that the head of Saudi Arabia, somehow, even if he was involved in the murder of the Washington Post journalist, that somehow this man, because he's now going to give us $1 trillion, that beats every other value. Well, I don't think that's the future most of us want. I think we want to hold up some other values that will be in competition with money. I'm not saying we of course we need money. Of course we need a good economy, but it's not like that's everything. And it's not that the other values aren't there. So how do we begin to really address some of those emerging issues? We can't go back. It's not going to be like it was when I was growing up, so the people now have to take a look at what's there, what's being written about, and that's the danger of not having rewriting history, condemning certain books, silencing journalists, being afraid of anything that doesn't feed what I think is right. That's the danger zone, because we've got to keep opening up people's minds and hearts. And that's where I think contemplation and all the disciplines can be wedded together, not mushed, but they feed each other. They're a dance. It's a dance,
Absolutely. And I'm so happy that you ended on that note for many reasons, partially because, a lot of the work Emma and I do is to kind of look into how some of those conservative and traditional movements can create rigidity. And so I'm really happy and glad that you have joined us to share for people an alternative way. Because it's so easy to just point and say, well, that's wrong. And we don't want to be that way. But what are we imagining, and how can we use practices like contemplation and working on our openness to other people? How can we use those as like new social movements to kind of challenge some of that stuff? So very grateful that you came, and thank you so much for sharing with us.
Well, thank you for a very stimulating conversation on great questions.
That was Nancy Sylvester, IHM, sharing her insights on how contemplation and social justice can inform and strengthen one another. As a reminder, you can visit the website iccdinstitute.org for more information and to purchase Nancy's books, or visit Amazon to purchase her book, Journey Faith in an Entangled World.
One thing we hope listeners take away is the importance of rest and recharge, finding whatever methods help you sustain your energy and clarity. Different forms of prayer, like the contemplative practices we explore today, are a powerful way to center yourself during difficult and uncertain times.
In a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming, we need to be strong, grounded, and collected if we want to engage thoughtfully with the challenges facing our communities and society.
So take the time to nourish your inner life and your inner self. And remember that the work we do outwardly is always stronger when it's rooted in internal reflection, awareness, and care.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time for more conversations that connect faith, history, and social change.
Goodbye.